It's time to step out now into cosmos, into mythos, into psyche.
I say welcome back to another podcast. This one, Edward Tick returns to talk about the apocalypse and something that he's quite an expert on, which is trauma and how we can navigate our traumas during these times. Some really fun facts about trauma, where it comes from, at least the word, and how to work with it. Ed's written a couple books aside from the one we talked about last time, which is The Practice of Dream Healing, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the Asclepian work. His other two books, the ones that he's really well known for, is Warrior's Return, Restoring the Soul After War, and War in the Soul, Healing Our Nation's Veterans from PTSD. So he has some deep insight around this, and there is lots of trauma to go around these days. And I myself got some good clarity about trauma, because in my own mind, I feel like I had maybe a misconception about how big of a word that is. And I guess echolocating my own trauma. And so we talk about that. We talk about the boneyard. We talk about Venus. There's a lot. But most importantly, trauma and the return. That, yes, we all want to return to the way things were. Unfortunately, I just don't think that's going to happen, nor does it ever happen like that when we set off on a journey. There's healing in the return, but not always. Sometimes the hero's journey is really botched up in the return because we don't have something to return to. And so we become fragmented, and we don't have folks around us to share the stories with. And there's a lot of reasons why the return can get a little bit messy. So we also speak to that. If you didn't listen to the last show that Ed and I did, I think it was back in October, I point you to it because we talk a lot about dream healing and what brought me to Ed in the first place. And if you don't do that before you listen to this one, just a little bit of an intro on who Edward Tick is. He's a poet. He's very interested in trying to capture language and images around the soul and cross-cultural healing. He's a very distinguished teacher, has taught at places like Pacifica, the U.S. military training facilities, Hospice Association, Jung Societies. And yeah, he's amazing. He's got a big heart. He's mythic. And essentially, he's devoted to the work that I think we all are doing on some level, whether we're fully immersed in it or not, is we're trying to reclaim the soul. We're trying to restore ourselves in that kind of a way. And he's a bit of an expert on it. And I love talking to Ed. And everything about this conversation, I think, will resonate with you and hopefully bring you towards his books and the work that he does. He leads these trips to Greece where these modern-day Asclepian experiences happen. I really do hope I get to be a part of one of those someday. And yeah, you can find Ed's work at the Soldier's Heart, or not the, but soldiersheart.net. That's soldiersheart.net. Even Peter Levine says of Ed that he's one of our wisest elders for understanding the complex dimensions of war trauma. Now, I don't think it has to just be war trauma. I just think it's the nature of trauma. And so how can we understand that both astrologically and mythically? And really, that's the spirit of this here conversation you're about to hear. And so if at any point during the conversation you feel a bit of this restoration happening in your own soul, and maybe you choose to share it with a friend or a family member experiencing trauma in these times, consider leaving some stars or a review on your podcast app. And if you do so, if you leave a review, take a screenshot of it, send it my way, and I will link you with a class of your choosing from my website, which is at holstoheavens.com. So if you leave a review with some stars, you get a free class. It's amazing. Basically $20 worth of value for just sharing some love. And if you don't want to do it that way, you can always support the podcast and all that I do at Patreon. You just go to patreon.com/AdamSummer and you can peruse the different tier levels. One of the things I've been tapping into, being that I'm in Boulder and I'm surrounded by a lot of college kids, and some of the conversations I've got into and also what I've been seeing on the news, is college kids are pretty unhappy with what's going on because they're paying a lot of tuition for these online classes, and looking like the fall is going to be like that as well. They're starting to, drop out and realize that there's other ways of being educated. It's like, if all your classes are going to be online, why not just find good online content, because there's tons of it, right? And that's how I have to offer. Not have to, but I also choose to, because I like the reach to be global. And so if you are wanting to take your learning of astrology to another level, you can find all of my classes and everything that I do, even a route to become a certified astrologer, at patreon.com/AdamSummer. So if you are one of those college kids and you dabble with astrology and you now are uncertain about your future with the university, well, there's an option for you this summer. That could be your summer school extended forward. So anyways, I really do hope you enjoy this conversation with Ed, and I will talk with you on the other side. Ed, how are you?
Hello, Adam. I'm well in spite of the crisis that we're all in. Thank you. I'm honored to be back with you. And how are you?
Yeah. No complaints. It's liminal, I suppose, is a good word to describe the feeling. Stuck between two places and, very frustrated around truth at this point, or trust and truth. It's hard to know what's going on fully. Isn't that true?
That's true, yes. And we'd better at least trust that little bit of truth, or we've got nothing left to stand on.
I mean, there are universal truths that I think you're pretty privy to that do stand the test of time. So maybe we start there. What do you feel is going on from a mythic perspective, Ed?
Well, I would like to say to all of our listeners and friends out there, welcome to the apocalypse.
Yeah, and the meaning of that word too.
Yes, what I affirm is going on now for all of us is not just the coronavirus pandemic, but rather that we are in an apocalypse. Apocalypse is an ancient Greek word, and it literally means to take the covering off, to reveal what has been hidden. So when I say we are in an apocalypse now, it is because all of the universal and the natural and the human forces that have been ignored for many, many years, for generations, have all gathered and are visiting us in a monstrous storm. And so we are not only experiencing the coronavirus pandemic, but pandemic is also an ancient Greek word. It means all people, pandemos. So we are all affected and threatened by the coronavirus, but we are also all affected and threatened by climate change, by fires and tornadoes and windstorms and tidal waves.
Locusts.
And locusts and the mass migrations, water shortages, food shortages, cities going underwater. We could go on and on. One of the best analogies for us to understand what we're going through, I believe, is the biblical story of the Israelite slavery in Egypt, 400 years of slavery, and the 10 plagues that the divine sent to try to convince Pharaoh and the Egyptians to let the people go. So they, as you said, they were sent locusts, they were sent fire, they were sent frogs. Well, they were overwhelmed by frogs. We have a frog plague also, and that is that they're dying off from climate change. That's also a plague, because without frogs, we're in real deep trouble. We'll be overrun by mosquitoes and other insects. So we could look at the 10 plagues and see that we have our version of the 10 plagues going on. And humanity, and especially our leadership, has not changed as a result of these natural plagues coming upon us. So God help us, we are now with the coronavirus, and it's killing people. Well, when the locusts are eating Africa and people are starving, our leadership doesn't care, and it doesn't stop and make us change anything. But perhaps now, like the last plague in Egypt was the killing of the firstborn, now, when the plague is worldwide and striking millions of people, it's forced us to stop, because we human beings didn't stop. And so we are being stopped by the forces of nature in the universe responding to us. Even with the recent climate change reports from the United Nations that were saying, well, we've got 10 years to turn this around. Guess what? We don't have 10 years to turn this around. The universe says, now, stop what you're doing now. And if you don't stop, I'm going to stop you. So we are in apocalypse. As you rightly said, it's a liminal time. Liminal time is transitional time between eras, between worlds, between forms of consciousness. We're in a different consciousness. We have to recreate ourselves and each other. We don't know what it's going to look like. People think we're going to get back to the old way of being, but really we can't, and we shouldn't. And we're going to have to create a new world, and we have no idea what it's going to look like. And leadership has to respond, or if we don't change our ways, the universe is going to continue to push back and stop us.
What a way to start. And you're a word guy, Ed, and you mentioned with pan as pandemic, and then we also, of course, have pandemonium and panacea. And the root of this word pan, of course, can be traced to mythological Pan. And what's really interesting from the angle I see this on, I wrote a piece on it maybe a couple of months ago, is how that relates to Capricorn. Like the origin story for the sign Capricorn relates to Pan. And of course, he's our god of nature, right?
Yes.
And so with these words, that like Pan meaning all-inclusive, and if Pan hints towards the wilds, then it speaks to everything you're talking about. Like when we're living out of balance with nature, and there's no, I mean, it seems like half of the nation doesn't even believe global warming exists. And so how can you turn the ship around when people not only don't believe it, they never even think about it? It's not a reality. And so, well, there's larger forces, and you say the universe, and I'm with you on the universe, but then the micro is looking at the planets that are lining up in Capricorn that kind of bring us intimations of Pan.
Yes.
There's quite the situation in the sky, and I don't know how much you track astrology, Ed, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime little configuration with all the big heavy hitters in the outer solar system in Capricorn. And we astrologers have been looking at this forever. And the fact that it's happened, it's not about the virus specifically. It's not about anything specifically. You can't get lost in the details. It's this big story that I knew you would be the perfect person to talk to around it, because it is an apocalypse and cycles within cycles, right? And so, like within your cosmology, Ed, how would you articulate the great big cycle? Like, do you resonate with Plato's version of the great year, or how do you contextualize it, and also where we're at in it?
Before I jump into that, I'll just add your wise observation of all the words we have that come from the god Pan. And let me please add that panic also comes from Pan.
Mm-hmm.
And that when we are out of balance, that God will send us panic to try to wake us up. And this the pandemic is sending panic around the world, but as you rightly point out, not to all people. Everybody is not open to it. What we learn over and over again is that if we do not listen to the forces that are speaking to us, then they will continue to increase in force against us. And this is true for the individual level and the global level. The more we repress what needs to be expressed, the stronger it gets, and it turns into, in the individuals, it turns into symptomatology. We can say the same thing, that these plagues being sent to us are like the symptoms of the world disorder that we were all in together. And I agree with you that this is in the stars and that it is predicted astrologically. Our listeners know we are at the end of the age of Pisces, and we are transitioning into the age of Aquarius. And Pisces was, you know better than I, but patriarchal, hierarchical, competitive, and we are still in that time. It's ending, and it's so far it's ending a pretty violent death, and it takes a long time to transition into a new age. And so part of our challenge is to see us and accept that we are in the liminal space that you rightly observe, and that we need to collaborate as much as we can with the transformation to a new world order. And we're also mortal, and we're not going to see it. So a part of the challenge is to accept ourselves in this lifetime as that we are servants of the cosmos, and either going to be harmed and just maybe destroyed by it, or we're going to wake up and collaborate with the larger order to try to help the transformation occur.
Yes, please. So you bring up the age of Pisces, which I've never given that proper voice, I don't think, ever on my podcast, talking about these great ages. And it's something that's really important, precession and the Yuga cycle. And one interesting idea about these big ages, Ed, is there's a prophet at the beginning of each one of them, or like an image that for that breadth of time, 2,000 plus years, give or take, you have that, in a way, mascot. And so, for example, with Pisces, it's the fishes, but Christ. It's like Christ came in around 2,000 plus years ago, or whenever the date is, whatever you agree on. And when you travel to that point in history, you have not an identical situation, but archetypally, the Romans are very similar to a lot of imperialistic Western civil cultures, like the one we live in. And the more you learn about the Romans, the more loathsome you become of them, right? And I think that might be the case in 2,000 plus years when people learn about Americans and such, because like it's like the history that's writ in those books, like oftentimes it doesn't tell the whole story. And the older I get and the more I read about that time period, the more interested I become about like what actually was happening in culture, like in Egyptian culture, or within the shadows, right? Because so much of the history of where I study from, and also you with the Asclepian work, was very much alive then, like in Hellenistic Egypt and whatnot. And I guess my question for you is maybe around that, like how can we look back to the beginning of an age and see what the message of Christ was in that time, and then as we're wrapping up the journey and moving into this next one, like how can we learn from the beginning as a transition into the next, I think is what my question is.
Okay. Well, one of the matters that you indicate is that during these long ages, the patterns of mythology, the organization of society, the blessings and conflicts that humanity brings to the surface really all repeat and mirror each other. So, for example, when you're talking about Rome, you're absolutely right that I believe that you're correct in saying that our modern age is a very close replication of the Roman era. So if we look more closely, Jupiter was the king of the gods in Rome, and Mars, the god of war, was the second most important god, and the Romans worshipped warfare and very, very, very strict legal, social organization and control. We have that kind of authoritarian control coming from our leadership and imposing itself more and more on our civilization. And we certainly have the worship of violent force and using it. And we could say that we are like the Roman Empire in having a Caligula or Nero-like leadership that only indulges itself and doesn't care about the population, and that uses force as its almost its favorite and its reflexive response to any conflict. And so the pattern, the mega pattern of civilization is the same throughout the era. And what we're hoping and looking and working for is massive global structural change. And that's what apocalypse, that's the possible blessing of apocalypse, is that it breaks down the entire world order. Nature and governments and communities and societies are all fragmenting, and we are going into a period of extreme chaos, which you and I recognize as liminal. The world order has to be destroyed or destroy itself so that we can recreate it. Hermann Hesse simply said, who would be born must first destroy a world. That's true about the individual. It's true about the civilization. The old world order that no longer serves has to fall apart and be destroyed so that we can try to recreate it in a more balanced way. The struggle, you're right, is how do we possibly bring this kind of awareness and willingness to leadership and to masses who are utterly ensconced in the old way and want the old way to come back and don't realize how destructive the old way was, and that this has led us to this condition.
Starting today. It's Friday, by the way, May 1st, for everyone listening into the future in many states.
Yes.
Yes, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. States are opening up prematurely.
Yeah.
So
we're not dancing around the maypole today.
No. Maybe
there too. This used to be a time of rebirth and celebration. And to jump into that prematurely, as you just indicated, is really dangerous.
Yeah, we were talking backstage about your son who's in Australia, and I know there's a lot of listeners in New Zealand and Australia, and just how well that area of the world is dealing with it in contrast to where we're at. And it's I don't know, I don't really fall into the fear of it. It's just unfortunate, like, that I find myself stuck in the belly of the beast with all of you in it, because it's like, I don't want to be in the midst of this, Ed. I wish I was in Dartmoor still, but it's all perfect, and I do always have an eye on fate. And so I think, like, one of the constant questions I have turning around in my mind is, if it is fated for all of us to be in this situation right now, what is our individual role to play in the turning of the great age, right? And yes. So for me, it's having conversations like this and writing about it and just sharing this information that I'm no expert on. Like, I'm constantly trying to find myself in it all as well. But, like, it's the spirit of the exploration that I find that can be medicine for people. Like, it allows people to go deeper into the mythic and deeper into all of these big ideas, and hopefully find great information themselves and bring it back. And for me, that's all I can do. Like, I don't know what else I can do when I'm in lockdown. You know what I mean? So I'm just curious, like, how does that look for you? Because when you're contemplating a big cycle, I guess it's very daunting to think, well, what's the point? It becomes existential almost. Where it's like, what's the point? But like, we all have medicine to share. And so how do you encourage folks, young folks, those getting back from war, to actually plug back in a meaningful way? How do you contribute to this turning?
Well, it's a wonderful question to explore together. I'm actually ironically feeling mobilized and not necessarily hopeful about the big picture and how that's going to evolve, but I am feeling hopeful and energized in motivating people and in helping in my small way to contribute to the transformation of consciousness. And it's quite relevant to war and to my work with the military and veterans over the decades in several ways. So one thing to say is that we are, during these apocalyptic times when we are all experiencing massive global trauma in numerous ways, I, as a psychotherapist and a teacher, I'm incredibly busy now because the global trauma and people's panic in front of this pandemic is triggering their own deepest traumatic wounds, personal and collective. So many people are dreaming about the pandemic, and their personal consciousness is uniting with what's going on in the cosmos. And as I work with people long distance, their own traumatic issues are being triggered intensively, and they're experiencing, oh, I am connected to the whole in this way. And there's an opportunity to really do deep healing work on the individual and on the culture. In addition to that, I am working a lot with our veterans now during this. Some of them are in crisis, in increased crisis, because, well, they've been to war and now they're not at war, but they're feeling like as if it were a war-like condition because so many violent forces are arrayed against us. So one matter is they are feeling that at war and endangered and threatened. So that's the negative part. But the positive part is that veterans, countless numbers of veterans feel, and non-veterans, feel their inner warrior mobilized, the warrior archetype. During times of crisis, the warrior archetype does awaken and wants to serve. The core values of the warrior archetype are not causing death and destruction, but the core values are preservation and protection. And so the numbers of veterans I'm talking with, like to you now, I want to do something. I need to do something. The people are in danger, and it's my proper role and responsibility to run into the danger and help them. Whereas ordinary citizens who haven't had traumatic experience or training run away from the danger just to get safe. So warriors want to serve now, and they are more experienced in dealing with these kinds of conditions. So I find my work extremely relevant, and I am working on teaching the transition to, or teaching people to understand the transition from military trauma to global trauma, from what we have experienced on a large scale arena of violence, to realize that the entire world is in that arena of threat, violence, unpredictability, danger now. And in fact, we can learn a great deal from warriors and that experience to understand what we're all experiencing and to help guide us through. So ironically, I'm feeling very relevant and tuned in now, more so than in quieter times when only the really challenged and suffering people care about this material.
The definition of trauma, I think, is important to try to explore here, because I myself, I think, would fall into a camp of, like, when I explore the idea of trauma, like, I don't think I have a ton of trauma. Like, my body does. Like, yeah, I've lost people along the way. But trauma, for some reason, is such a charged word that, like, I think of watching a friend get blown up next to me in combat, or just witnessing something so horrific that, like, whenever anything triggers that memory, I go into a fight or flight, or I shut down. Like, for some reason, that's the definition in my mind of trauma, but I think it's more nuanced than that, isn't it? And so I'm curious, like, is everyone traumatized? Like, how would you describe it or define it?
Well, okay. Trauma also is an ancient Greek word. Both of us love that tradition and keep returning to it. So trauma in ancient Greek meant, well, originally it meant a stabbing wound. So if somebody was attacked, wounded by a spear or an arrow or a knife, that was literally the physical trauma. And the ancients, who are much more holistic than we are today, understood that when we are pierced by violence physically, we are also pierced emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. And so from that understanding, I define trauma as any time we are pierced unwillingly by the violence of the world. Where if it's a willing pierce, let's remember that when we pierce each other, when we enter and penetrate each other, the other side of trauma is love. The experience of penetrating another is the act of love, but the experience of forcefully, violently penetrating another against their will is traumatic. So anything that feels violent and feels against the order and against morality and pierces us is traumatic. Now, that's not the same as Buddha saying that life is suffering. Life is suffering. We all experience old age, illness, death. And it may or may not be traumatic as we pass through it. But if we experience it as violent in any way, it becomes traumatic. If we experience negative things imposed on us, it becomes traumatic. So if we see someone else hit by a car, or as you said, if we're in the military and we see somebody blown up next to us, sure, that's traumatic. The violence of the world is penetrating us, and that bomb or that car might not have hit us, but it hit a neighbor or a loved one, and life changes immediately. We all learn that we are vulnerable. It seems like the violence is random. We understand that any and every one of us can be victimized by it, and it changes the way we place ourselves in the universe, just as this does now. Another archetypal way that I've studied this condition we're in and supported myself in it was I just went back and reread Albert Camus' amazing book, The Plague. Okay,
is that about the plague?
Well, it's about every plague.
Okay,
and that's the point. That was published in 1945. Okay. People thought it was a metaphor for France under the Nazi occupation, but Camus didn't only mean that. He also had studied plague journals through the ages from all over Europe and for centuries before, and he was looking at the archetypal conditions of plague, what it does to all people at all times. And I was quite, shocked, amazed, enlightened to watch that in this work of fiction, the plague upon this small, isolated African city evolved in exactly the way ours did. It came in slowly. The leadership was in denial. people stayed in denial until there were so many deaths that they couldn't be in denial anymore. A lot of people went out and partied and purposely exposed themselves instead. People became more and more aware that this is impersonal and could strike anyone. At first, it struck the elderly and in the infirm, and then as it kept developing, it hit healthy young people and children, and it turned into different forms of plague, so that it went from the lungs to the heart to the guts. That's all happening now. And I went, oh my gosh, Camus saw the archetypal pattern of all plague and mapped it for us in his book, and we're going through the same pattern. And finally, Camus, one of Camus' characters, says, well, plague is us. Plague is in us all the time, lying dormant and waiting for the conditions that reawaken it. And that's another gloss on the historical moment we live in. We together have, all of humanity has created the global conditions during which this kind of scourge reawakens and shows us how out of balance we are and we have become with nature, and demands that we become conscious and responsible and try to put things back in balance. So that's how I feel that well, I turned 69 last week, so I hope I'll be here.
Happy belated.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm doing well for my age.
Yeah.
But I'm also realistic that I'm not going to be here for a very long time, and I might be more vulnerable to, I am more vulnerable to the illness. And here's another analogy to war. Oh, okay. I ran a Zoom group for my community last week to give everybody time to talk and share what they're experiencing. So in my group, I had a combat veteran who said, what I learned in combat is that I might not be alive an hour from now. So I'd better only think and feel what's most important in my life and only do right, even in combat. And then a woman who had the coronavirus and was in recovery, and she was in quarantine, but she joined us on Zoom from her quarantine. And she said, I never thought about this before or realized it, but that's the same lesson. I'm getting the same lesson from the virus that our brother got from being in combat. I've been living for weeks not knowing if I'm going to be alive tomorrow. And it's changed my entire orientation and value system. So I have to stop delaying what I really need and want to do. I have to determine who and what are most important to me and work on those relationships and be really present and let all of the trivial go. And both of these people are doing a complete life inventory and recreating their value system based on this unpredictable and threatening and traumatic condition that we're all in. So it's an extraordinary opportunity for self and collective recreation and rebirth if we take it.
I think that was the answer to my initial question around, like, how can we all help in the turning? It's that kind of epiphany on living. And it also brings up the dream that I was mentioning to you that I had last night, where I was in combat. Now, I've never experienced combat before, but I was an archer, and it was somewhat of a Viking setting. I couldn't see myself in the dream. Like, I could have been one myself, but there was this sensational feeling of, I'm ready for this. There was like the only image in my mind is remembering having to face this like bloody face, crazy-eyed Hellheimer kind of character. And I had 10 arrows and we were about to go rounds, right? And this fear of like, wow, I'm not going to, the possibility that my time is here was eminent in this dream. But then there was also this remembering of, you know how to shoot, you know how to be present, just do what you got to do kind of thing. And then I woke up, and in this interview that I was listening to this morning, the guy was talking about the same thing when asked about fate. And he was talking about the only time he actually really thought about it and kind of how fate healed him with his relationship being in Iraq was doing mission objectives and knowing that like anything could be an IUD, anything can blow him up at any time. And the only way he was able to overpower that maddening thought process in his head was to actually surrender to fate. And there's something to that in life when we're not being traumatized by the news and by the virus and by all the fear in the economy. It's like all we have is now. And it's like, well, if you're healthy, even if you're not, like you are here. And there's a lot that can be found here now. And I think that might contribute a lot to this turning, hey?
Oh, yes. I really like your dream. Thank you for sharing it with me and with our listeners. And I'd like to relate your dream to the rest of our conversation and to my work with warriors.
Please.
You say you rarely dream about warriors and you haven't dreamed much about yourself being in war, but here you saw yourself in a life-threatening war situation. So what I want to suggest is that your own inner warrior archetype is being awakened during this time. Your inner warrior is being awakened and you realize that it may be your time, it may be my time. We don't know and we can't know. We do have to just determine how we're going to fight back and resist against these forces. And it may or may not be with violence. It's interesting that you had 10 arrows, and earlier we were talking about the 10 plagues. So,
yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And warriors, the Buddhist warrior tradition, the Eastern and the spiritual warrior traditions all teach that to become a warrior, we have to accept our death. In fact, warriors say, I'm already dead. If I'm a warrior, I'm already dead, and I know it. And so I can go into the battle because I've let go of my personal life, and I'm only on this mission. And our modern veterans all say the same thing, that once they've been in combat, they accept the inevitability of their death and not knowing if they're going to get through this. And now I'll refer to, as you know, I work with the Vietnamese as well, and I lead healing and reconciliation journeys to Vietnam. The Vietnamese, in contrast to the Western world, in contrast to our country, there's actually no wartime chronic post-traumatic stress disorder in Vietnam because of some of these forces we're talking about. They accept karma. They accept fate and destiny. They don't think they can change it. They teach that we have to accept it and live with whatever karma we are sent. And they accepted that nationally and historically, as well as personally, about their own individual lives. In fact, they say that the American war in Vietnam was a karmic gift to them because it helped them correct their historical, their bad historical karma because of hundreds and thousands of years ago when the Viet people were pushed down from China down into Southeast Asia. They attacked other indigenous people and took their land. Mm-hmm. And so they said, we did wrong. Even if we had to do it, we did wrong by attacking and harming other people and taking their land. And so the French occupation and the Chinese invasions and Japan during World War II and the American War all corrected our karma and balanced us so that we can live in harmony and balance with ourselves and the universe again. So what you're saying about the acceptance of fate and destiny is really profound. The Greek tradition teaches us also. Greek philosophy called it anarche, which is usually translated as necessity. And it pretty much is the same concept as karma. And that is, what happens is the only thing that can happen. It had to happen. All the universal forces occurring at that time made this happen. And it's only our imagination that says something else could have happened, or if only I had done something else. So in both traditions, ancient Greek and Asian Buddhist, we are taught a deep, deep acceptance of fate and destiny, and challenged to say yes to it, and then embrace and work with those conditions. And that's very much how I work with our veterans and with other trauma survivors, that there has to be an affirmation of destiny. We have to say yes to what we've been given, rather than curse and complain and cry that life isn't treating us fairly. And that's it's a profound and difficult psycho-spiritual step for people to take, but we have to. And it's transformed my life also to be able to say yes to things that harmed me and that I wish had never happened. Yes, that's my karma. That's my destiny. That's what life is giving me, and I have to turn it into wisdom.
Medicine. So I just want to plug this real quick because, as you know, a lot of my listeners are also very interested in astrology. And so everything Ed just said relates entirely to any fear you have about future transits to your own chart or of the world. Just let it rest. Apply the medicine as much as you can to using astrology or any oracle for that matter about the future. We don't know enough to worry. Just get with that flow. Get good with Lady Fortune, right?
Yes. And don't try to interpret it in our human terms, but let it unfold. I'm with you. Thinking back on the oracles, there's so many stories from ancient Greece about the Delphi oracle and what happened, how people harmed themselves when they misinterpreted it according to their own human beliefs and wishes. So, right, don't do that. Let your chart unfold and do your best to cooperate with it, because this is what the universe has mapped out for you, rather than say, I don't like it, I don't want it, I know better. We don't. We can't.
We don't. And you mentioned something that I think is really important, because it's a lot of the work that I find myself doing. And with your definition of trauma also, like that's something I've learned in this conversation. One of the many things, like the stabbing wound piece, but how to work with the harm others have caused us without playing victim, by accepting it. Right? Like there's so much of that. Like people feel that with the government. They feel that with the healthcare system right now. They feel that in all these different ways. But also we all have our own personal dramas. And, for a situation, for example, where someone wrongs you and they also then refuse to talk to you, but defame you, and all these types of themes, like how do you deal with that with clients? Like, it has to do with acceptance, but like, how can you find closure with chapters of your life when you can't engage with that party? You know what I mean?
Oh, I sure do. And I've certainly had the experience many times. Okay. Well, I have had severe traumas in my life. And I haven't been able to reconcile with the people who caused them. Just very briefly, on my 10th birthday, I was born and raised in was born in the Bronx. My grandparents and father had a little delicatessen in the Bronx, and literally on my 10th birthday, as we were lighting the candles on my little birthday cake, the police called and said to my father, "Come back to the Bronx immediately. Your store is burning down."
Oh my goodness.
So I turned 10. The second I turned 10 and we tried to celebrate it, there was a much larger fire that destroyed my family's livelihood. I actually it took a long time. My parents lost their faith, and we struggled, and really the rest of my childhood was pretty miserable. But they all hated our fate, cursed it. My mother came to believe that our family was cursed, and she preached that to the rest of us. I never thought that way. I have worked my whole life to make friends with fire. I love fire. I'm my family fireman. I'm the one who makes the campfires and the fires in our fireplace.
Same.
And seriously, what I learned from that over time was the impact of trauma on me, on family systems, on communities, that we are often, I don't even want to say shaped, victimized. We are shaped by what the world sends us, and we can fall and collapse into the victim perspective and complain, why me, and this isn't fair. And that changes nothing. In fact, that makes our conditions even worse. Or we can say, yes, this is what happened. This is what life and the universe has given me. This is my destiny to live this. And how do I need to reshape myself? And what life lessons can I learn from this? I use the phrase with my veterans all the time. Your warrior wisdom. What warrior wisdom did you gain from that horrific encounter? And how did that reshape you in a positive way? So that's what I do with myself, and that's what I do with my psychotherapy patients. That we accept trauma, first of all, as liminal, as you earlier said, and everything is changing. The old order falls apart, and we have to recreate our order. And we say, yes, I affirm my destiny, and this had to happen. It's what the universe gave me. And now I have to reshape myself and my life in positive ways with this new wisdom gained.
Warrior wisdom.
Yes.
I like it. It's hard earned, and it is medicine as well.
It
and
sure is.
One place in the ancient world that warriors learned how to be warriors was Chiron's cave, right?
Right.
And
yes. The great teacher of warriors.
The great teacher of warriors. And I wonder sometimes, what if the CDC wasn't the center, but the centaur of disease control?
Ooh,
right?
I love that.
It's a meme. It's not mine, but it's good. And yeah. And but if it was the centaur that was giving us briefings and not the Red King talking about the possibility of injecting Lysol into our veins, how would that change things? What do you think Chiron and Asclepius and how they would handle this?
Well, we both love them and study them and do our best to recreate their ways. So let's remember Chiron's medicine. Natural medicine, not pharmaceuticals, not artificially created medicine, but natural medicines and healthy eating and chanting and singing and praying and taking dreams very seriously and reading the dreams for what they are telling us about our condition and how to guide ourselves and each other toward healing. So I think actually some people are finding their ways to Chiron's medicine. When we see, for example, the beautiful videos that have come out of Italy where everybody's on the streets singing to each other,
right?
Chiron would celebrate that. He'd say, yes, that's what you all should be doing. Look at get out in the air and look at each other and be in some kind of community again and sing to each other and strengthen your spirits that way. One example. In the larger picture, I'm really worried about this one. We're looking for the vaccine that will stop this virus. Well, on one hand, we need to do that. But on the other hand, that's continuing to turn everything over to modern science created in the laboratories and separate from nature and nature's ways, when we really need to be putting ourselves back in balance with nature. So leadership saying in Chiron's ways, how have we fallen out of balance with nature? What larger ways, collective ways do we need to change to put ourselves back in balance? Would come from Chiron and from Asclepius. A core principle of Asclepian medicine was, quoting Plato, restoring friendship between elements in us that have become competitive. Restoring friendship between competing elements. So we need to restore our friendship with nature. We need to restore our friendship with each other, with our food supply, with how we live our lives. Heal the terrible strife that is awakened between people in the natural world, between all of the forces by which we live, to restore cooperation and friendship. So I believe Chiron and Asclepius have a lot to teach us now. And of course, the healing dreams that are coming. A lot of people are having global dreams now, or dreams about the pandemic, and some of them indicate some of the new directions we need. I had a really interesting short dream last week that was my response, a kind of analysis and response about the crisis that we're in. My dream was simply that my wife, her name is Kate, so my wife Kate and Theodore Roosevelt were locked into a conference room together, sitting in two big leather easy chairs facing each other. And the cool thing in the dream that indicated transformation was that President Roosevelt was listening to my wife. That here we was, well, he was a great conservationist, but he was also a warrior, and he also
hunter, yeah,
and a hunter, right? So what I saw happening in the dream was the feminine talking to the masculine, and the two of them actually listening to each other and trying to be in cooperation for solutions to the crisis we're in. And we've lost that. And a restoration of the feminine. And please tell us how that's happening, and if there's astrological signs showing that the feminine principle is coming back in power to balance with the masculine. If that's what my dream said, and there's many ways in popular culture that the feminine is coming back as well. We have all these super women and warrior women and wonder women and we're seeing women warrior heroes coming back in popular culture, and in women taking political power and leadership and trying to do it in new ways, not in the old masculine way.
Yes.
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 Venus is so extraordinarily beautiful right now.
Yeah, you see her, huh?
Oh gosh, yes. Not today, it's raining here, but just about every day. She is blasting her beauty at us. And it does feel like another sign of the return of the feminine. And you bringing that up, that brings back to my memory Sappho's beautiful poem about the evening star.
Tell me.
Recite it and pray that this is what's happening for us. But Sappho wrote, about 600 BC? O evening star, you gather back to us what glowing dawn has scattered. You gather the sheep, you gather the lamb, you gather the child back to the mother. And that's not just their mothers, that's the great mother.
Right.
That's all of us returning to the great mother. And the feminine principle at beauty and goodness and softness calling us during this horrible time to come home to each other and come home to the mother.
That's deep, Ed. And how appropriate. She is watching on. She's at her maximum brightness.
Yeah.
Right now. And
let's see the goddess's eye looking at us now.
Potent. How do you spell Sappho? I think people are going to want to look that up.
Sappho.
Oh, it's P. See, even I got it wrong.
Double P.
I've seen it written before. Yeah.
In Greek, it would be Sappho.
Sappho, the evening star. No, it's wonderful, and even the Buddha, who we've brought up a couple times in the podcast, Christ too, relate to the morning star, right? Like, samadhi happened for the Buddha when the morning star appeared, and Christ often referred to as the morning star, and so it's this transition period. And everyone who tracks my work with Venus understands that we're also at the end of a pretty deep cycle with Venus that started in the fall of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And so this reset that's occurring, with all cycles, and that's why I love astrology so much, is you always have an opportunity, even if it's just once a month with a lunar cycle, to retune yourself to these mythic narratives and to make contact with these gods and goddesses and stories and so much of that wisdom. I mean, you're completely plugged into it and working on the front lines with those that have been really shattered by some of this world. And so I just really honor you for the work that you've done and do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And back at you, and never denigrate the importance of your work and the way that you are contributing to educate the public around the world in new consciousness. We all have to wake up together, and it's hard. And that's, we're in an age where we either, enough of us wake up together, or we're all going to sleep together.
Right. It always reminds me of that Ram Dass quote, "We're all walking each other home." And it's a perilous walk.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And glad you mentioned Ram Dass. Let's remember that after he was stricken with his stroke, he didn't curse, he didn't complain. He did what we were talking about earlier about embracing his destiny, his fate, and he called it fierce grace. Yeah. And he kept learning from it and teaching us to accept everything that happens with spiritual grace and benevolence, and learn from it and take it all as a divine gift, no matter what's sent.
Such a powerful teacher. Yeah.
Yes.
Divine grace being stroked.
Yeah.
Being stroked by the divine. Yeah. Rest in peace, Richard Alpert. Yes. And also John Prine. I'm going to use that John Prine song at the end of this podcast, I think, Ed.
Wow. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Are you a Prine fan? For some reason, I have a feeling you are.
Yeah.
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 Amazing, man. Well, let us know how people can find you and maybe work with you, read your incredible books. What's your website?
Thank you. Well, I've got two websites. One is just edwardtick.com. And my general work is there. All my books are on that website. And as you well know, and thank you for your support, in my work with the military and veterans all these decades, I also ran a nonprofit specializing in that work. And so people can also go to my nonprofit website, which is still up, and that's Soldier's Heart as one word, no apostrophe. So two websites, edwardtick.com or soldiersheart.net. And my email address is very simply dredtick@gmail.com. But just, my son laughs. It's spelled Dredtick, Dredtick. And of course, he's my beloved son, so he would dread his father and tease the hell out of him.
Mm-hmm.
And people, thank you for mentioning it. I do have my pretty influential book on Asclepius and dream healing. That's called The Practice of Dream Healing. And my two important books on healing from war and military violence are called War and the Soul and Warrior's Return. And they're not just for veterans and warriors, but they're profoundly relevant to these times that we are in, because they are a mythological and archetypal presentation, understanding, analysis of what happens to any of us when we pass through severe violent trauma, and what the homecoming journey, including what we've shared, the affirmation of destiny, the saying yes to what is and how to work with it, is in the core of those books and that kind of healing.
I recommend them to everyone of you listening. They're great books. I haven't finished all of them, but I have them now. And yeah, you're an incredible writer. It's important topics. And I really appreciate these conversations, Ed. We're going to have to do it again.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you, Adam. Likewise.
Yeah. And I'd ask about the next Asclepian retreat, but that's probably a great big question mark, isn't it?
It was going to be November. Actually, Greece is doing very well. They're one of the cleanest, most responsible countries in Europe, which surprised everybody because the world loves to trash Greece because of their financial crisis. Well, they've been exemplary in taking care of their people during this pandemic. So I am continuing to lead my Asclepian journeys to Greece. The next one was going to be this fall, but now the dates are on hold until we know when it's things are safely opened up again. So I don't know when, but I will do it. And
let us know, or at least me, because I want to hop over, have an excuse to come to Greece.
Oh, I'd love to. We'll do
this with you. Mm-hmm.
All right. Sure.
Beautiful, Ed. Well, have a great night. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adam. And thank you to all our listeners. Bless you, and all of you stay safe and well, and find really meaningful spiritual ways through this crisis.
Yeah. Love that. And so I hope that you enjoyed that conversation between Ed and I. What a sweet spot moment that was when he was talking about the mother, right? I love it. And I suppose the great question I step away from with this is still pondering like how I'm contributing to the great turning or the revelation. Doing my best with this astrology. Yet there's a yearning in my own soul for something else, more impactful. I don't know what it is. I mean, I do what I do with this, and I know a lot of you really get a lot of value out of it, and so that definitely warms me up and helps me remember. But how are you contributing to the great turning and seeing these little openings that are happening in this? Venus is indeed still bright, but she is now retrograde and she is falling from the sky. And so that is also a part of this story. If you're listening to this in the future, this is mid-May 2020, and we're about to sign off. But before I do that, I just want to point you again to Ed's site, which is soldiersheart.net. You can find his books there, audio lectures, the previous podcast that he and I did on Asclepian work. And I just want to thank Ed again so much for coming on, and hopefully it's not the last time either. Again, if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave some stars and a review. It's how you basically have good etiquette with listening to podcasts. It's free, and it's a way not just of sharing love, but like working with the algorithm of how podcasts get around and how iTunes works it and all that good stuff. And so you can do that on your podcast app. It's a little bit challenging with Podcast Addict and on Android phones, but it can be done. And if you do leave a review, take a screenshot, send it my way, and I will link you with a class of your choice. Also, the best of ways to support the show is at patreon.com/AdamSummer. There you'll find different options, pledge levels where you can support, and it will also increase your relationship to astrology tenfold because of all of the classes, and parlors, and patron-only podcasts, and even a chance to win a free reading with me. That's there at all of the different tiers. And it's also, I want to answer this because I've been getting tons of emails lately about the Bitcoin class I did for the CIA. And that too is available on my Patreon now. So if you want to support the show and learn a bunch of astrology, just go to patreon.com/AdamSummer. This podcast is brought to you by Solar Fire. If you go to alabe.com, you can take your interest in astrology to a higher dimension by getting some solar fire in your life. Just make sure you use promo code SOMA to get the 15% off of the program. So that's at alabe.com, promo code SOMA. And this podcast is also brought to you by 4 Sigmatic. Like I said before, it's really essential during these times to make sure that your body, your immune system is in tip top. Whether you believe this thing was made in Wuhan or it's some crazy alien conspiracy as well of what is going on, whatever it is, you still need a strong body and immune system to fight off whatever it is. And you can do that with mushrooms. Get some reishi, get some cordyceps, get some lion's mane inside of you, and it will do a lot of good for your fortification of these invisible realms. And so just go to foursigmatic.com and use promo code SOMA and you'll get 10% off of any of their products. Now, it's time for some John Prine. Gonna miss that guy. He is one of the greats. Was one of the great singer-songwriters, storytellers. And if you're not familiar with John Prine, like my girlfriend had no idea who John Prine was. I suppose it's an English thing. But he's the great comic storyteller. Oh, he's so good. And a quick story about how I discovered John Prine. My mom, once upon a time when I was like 21 years old, allowed me to use her car to road trip across the country because I think my brother crashed my car. And so I was using hers, and the only CD that she had in the car was John Prine's Greatest Hits. And so I threw it in the CD player and began listening. And the first thing that happened, I was like, my mom doesn't even really listen to music. But when she listens to music, she listens to this. Interesting, Mom. Like it was a fascinating moment, like in seeing my mom in a different way. But then I listened to that CD on repeat. You know how it is if you're ever in a car and there's only one disc inside of that vehicle. And so I listened to so much John Prine on that road trip, and it also got me into like listening to his live stuff. I've seen him live, and he's legendary. He's a legendary singer-songwriter, storyteller, and we lost him to COVID-19. And it's tragic, but it's also, we all got our time for transition. We've all got that moment. And so who holds the torch these days? I'd have to say John Craigie. John Craigie probably holds the torch in a similar way of singer-songwriter, storyteller, comic. And if you're not familiar with John either, check out John Craigie. He is hilarious. Check out his live album called Capricorn in Retrograde. I mean, just the title alone gets you situated. So anyways, the song by John is called Sam Stone. It's about a man who returns from Vietnam and spends all his money on that hole that he's digging in his arm. It's a tragic song, but a cathartic one, because I think all of us have someone in our lives, whether it's a friend or a family member, that has served time in the army or has been affected in some terrible way, and this song really gets to the heart of it. And so rest in peace, John Prine. Your spirit definitely lives on in many ways, but also in this podcast now, which is amazing. Music in the background, Richard Houghton. I used him in the last podcast as well. I really like what he does with the guitar and just very spacious sounds. Check him out. Support these artists. Artists are getting hit really hard right now. And there's a lot of ways that you can support artists by purchasing their albums, merch. You know, the drill. And so anyways, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Thank you for listening this far. I hope that there was value in this podcast and it lives on in you for some time. And I will talk with you next, I think, about poisonous plants. But I'm also trying to get out of here on June 3rd. We'll see how that works. And so I'm in a bit of a crunch. And so if I don't get a podcast out by the end of the month, don't hold it against me. We're in the middle of a global pandemic and I'm trying to get home. But I will do my best to get another podcast out this month. Again, thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, and I will speak with you all soon enough. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Sorry I wasn't able to share the song. YouTube is a bit more strict than the podcast apps. So if you'd like to listen to the whole show, go over to Spotify, the podcast app, SoundCloud, or really wherever podcasts are found. This is Tree Theater. Ciao.